Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Free Library of Philadelphia Online. My name is Andrew Nurkin, and I'm the Deputy Director for Enrichment and Civic Engagement at the Free Library. Tonight, we are excited to welcome you to a conversation with Dr. Valerie I. Harrison and Dr. Catherine Peach D'Angelo, authors of Do Right by Me, Learning to Raise Black Children in White Spaces, out from Temple University Press. Before we get started, two housekeeping notes. First, for a complete list of Free Library of Philadelphia virtual programs and services, visit freelibrary.org. As you know, February is Black History Month, and the Free Library is celebrating with dozens of programs that can be found at freelibrary.org/Black History Month. Tonight, Valerie and Catherine will be in conversation with award-winning journalist Tracey Matisak, who will introduce the authors. Please note that you can submit questions for the authors using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And we'll drop a link to purchase the book directly from Temple University Press in the chat, as well as a code for 30% off. Thank you to Temple University Press for providing that code. That code is valid until March 31st, so definitely pick up a copy of the book, get that discount now until March 31st. With that, I would like to pass the screen to Tracey Matisak for our tonight's conversation. Tracey, the screen is all yours.
Well, thank you so much, Andrew, and good evening, everyone. I am Tracey Matisak, and I am delighted to introduce our guests tonight, Dr. Valerie Harrison, and of course, Dr. Catherine Peach D'Angelo. Just by way of background, Valerie Harrison has spent more than 30 years as an attorney, a professor, and a higher education administrator. She currently serves as senior advisor to the president of Temple University, where she also earned her PhD in African American Studies. Valerie earned her undergraduate degree at the University of Virginia and her law degree from Villanova University. And her co-author, Kendi D'Angelo, is a lifelong educator with more than 25 years of experience as a teacher and administrator. Kendi currently serves as Assistant Vice President for Administration and Planning at Temple University, and Kendi is a graduate of St. Joseph's University. She holds a doctorate in education from Temple. Most importantly for our conversation tonight, however, Kendi and her husband Mike are the parents of Gabriel, who is at the center of the book that we'll be discussing tonight, Do Right by Me. We invite you, as Andrew said, to be part of the conversation. Just a reminder that you can click on that little Q&A icon that you'll find at the bottom of your screen and just put your questions there, and we'll get through as many as we can for Val and Kendi. One more very important note, and that is that Do Right by Me has just been nominated for an NAACP Image Award in the category of Outstanding Literary Work Instructional. So with that said, Valerie Harrison and Kendi D'Angelo, welcome to the Free Library of Philadelphia, and congratulations on the nomination.
Thank you.
Thank you, Trace. Thank you
very much.
Well, this is an exciting time and a very timely book. Val, I'll begin with you. Why this book and why now?
You know, Trace, Gabriel, as you know, is the motivation for the book. Kendi and I have been friends for more than 20 years and spent many of those years talking about everything from relationships to our value systems to race and racism. However, when Kendi and her husband, Mike, adopted Gabe, who is a beautiful biracial boy, in 2011, the stakes really grew from the two of us having philosophical conversations to the two of us trying to support each other. Kendi being a white mother, raising a Black child, and me along with some others in her community trying to support her. But Kendi had real questions and concerns about race, about identity, about culture. And I would hear these same concerns that Kendi expressed from other white women who had adopted Black children. They would share concerns about everything from hair care, for example, for girls, to affirming body images, to having a diverse community of Black female achievement for their daughters, for example. And so it was clear to Kendi and me from her experience, as well as the experience of these women, that white parents of Black children wanted badly to parent well, but they had real questions and they had real concerns. And so we wrote the book to help address those concerns. But when we started the project, we initially thought that the book was for white parents of Black and biracial children, but it quickly became clear that the book was for anyone who was part of a Black child's life and cared about their development, a coach, a mentor, an aunt, an uncle. But we also realized that the research and scholarship that we were bringing together applied not only to Black children in white families, but to Black children in any family, a child who has to navigate a white space, be that a predominantly white school or a neighborhood.
Yeah, I couldn't help but think as I read this that I wished not only had my Irish mom had this book many, many years ago, I think it would have been hugely beneficial for us, but also for my husband and me as we raised our own children here in the suburbs of Philadelphia. So it certainly is timely. And Katie, you and Mike adopted Gabriel right after he was born. Was it your intention to adopt a Black child, or did it just sort of work out that way?
Yeah, we, when we really came to find that we were ready to expand our family of two, to possibly be considered as adoptive parents, we really went into it saying, and I'm grateful for a faith life and a spiritual life that allows us both to say, we are open to wherever we're called to be. And so with that comes the great gift of Gabriel. So we knew early on there would be a lot to learn just about being parents, but we also knew, once we matched to Gabriel and we adopted him from birth, we knew that we were going to have to equip our son for an experience that was far more complex than anything we had experienced in our lifetime. And it was really evident that we would need to confront the all too prevalent colorblind and post-racial ideologies that really surround us. And that both Mike and I would have to learn to navigate racism and its dehumanizing outcomes so that we could help our son to navigate it when it came time.
Yeah, I want to come back to what you said about the whole post-racial colorblind idea, because I think that's really important, and I want to come back to that. But before we get to that, how big a phenomenon, Katie, is transracial adoption?
Yep. So there's not a ton of really precise data on it because people's and families' path to adoption is really unique and actually it varies state by state. How adoption happens. So the data that we were sort of looking at to inform us in the book was probably about every year, about 140,000 children join a family by adoption. And probably, about 23% roughly would be considered a different race or ethnicity from the parent, the adoptive parent.
Val, I'd like you to pick up on what Katie talked about, because you address this in the book and you talk about the idea of the post-racial sort of mentality. And I think for many people, when we saw Barack Obama elected president, people were lulled into this idea that we were in fact now a post-racial society. Or there's also the color blindness idea that, hey, I don't even see your color. And you're right about how that's not helpful. Unpack that a little bit.
It is not. As we dove in, Katie and I became increasingly troubled by the possible outcomes for Black children when we fail to equip them with positive racial identity. One, confusion about racial identity has been linked to psychological distress for Black children. And this is the next piece, really, it stuck with Katie, like we couldn't shake it. The brain science tells us that pain from social exclusion or feeling less than or marginalized and the pain from illness or injury share the same brain pathways, if you will. And so whether you're punched in the face or whether you're excluded or feel excluded from an opportunity because of your race, it signals pain in the body. And so for Katie, we couldn't shake it. She said, Val, there is literal pain in the body of Black children when they feel less than, when they don't feel really good about themselves. It also leads to anxiety, to low self-esteem, to blood pressure problems. But then we also looked at stereotype threats that hinder performance when students lack a strong sense of racial pride. You know, when members of a group have been negatively stereotyped, they fear being judged in light of that stereotype, and it undermines performance. And so Black people, for example, have been stereotyped as less than capable intellectually, and we know that. And so Black students in predominantly white schools, for example, may feel pressure that white students don't have to dispel these stereotypes. And the extra pressure, it's a distraction. You know, it depletes your memory. It takes energy to suppress the negative thoughts, which means that you have less energy to focus on the task. But what Kendi and I knew and learned, and we thought it would be helpful to parents, is the stereotype threat can attach to you if you understand what real Blackness means. And so we always give this example. When you understand that Black people led the world in scientific innovation, that ancient African people moved and stacked millions of stones so perfectly that they created the Great Pyramid, that Black people developed the first mathematical textbook 3,900 years ago, then AP Physics is not a stretch for you as a Black student in a predominantly white school. And you can expect to pursue STEM professions. And so this is some of the wonderful work of the scholars we have brought together. And we believe that it was really critical for our children to be exposed to this work so that the impact of racism is minimized in their life.
Yeah. So, Val, as a follow-up to that, as you read the book, it's conversational in tone, and there's a lot of back and forth between the two of you. But there is a lot there about the historical Black experience in America. Why was it important to you to include that historical context?
You know, Trish, part of developing cultural esteem and positive racial identity is having an accurate understanding of your condition, right? Of understanding the source of disadvantage, right? It's also understanding a wonderful and rich legacy of resilience, a legacy of resistance. That is key. But also the book, in the book, we try to give strategies and tools to help Black children navigate racism. But in order to navigate racism, you have to be able to identify racism, right? Racism still operates in the lives of Black people in education, in healthcare, in the criminal justice system, and in employment. And so what our goal is to help parents, equip parents with a knowledge and understanding both of the historical underpinnings, but also how racism continues to operate in the lives of Black people so they can then equip their children to navigate that space.
Yeah. Critically important. Kendi, what has been for you the most challenging and the most wonderful part about raising Gabe thus far? And we should point out that he's now 9, correct? 9, okay. So what's been the most challenging thing and the most wonderful thing about raising Gabriel?
Oh, so many to choose from in both categories. So I think probably, I mean, if I was going to narrow it down, probably the single most challenging part is, and we've talked about this, Val and I have talked about this a lot. You know, there's always this deep pain and worry that because my life experience is so dramatically different because of the color of my skin, because my life experience has been informed in such a different way. As a mother, you know, you want to prepare your child for everything. You want to anticipate everything. You want to comfort them and shield them from everything. And I think, you know, almost daily, it's that reminder that, you know, just keep putting one foot in front of the other. And learning and preparing and studying, right? You're motivated to do everything to be the best possible parent that you can be. And so the challenge is, you know, trying to be that in all ways and be the best parent that I can be for my son. The great gift has been consistently him. I mean, he is brilliant. He's witty, he's funny.
Yes.
You know, and we always talk about just the great fortune and gift of him, and Val actually addresses this in the beginning of the book. You know, we had no idea the significance of his name, Gabriel, who, you know, Gabriel in many traditions is the messenger, right? And I always think of, I believe it's Henry Ossawa Tanner, his painting, The Annunciation, where Gabriel is represented as the light in that painting, and it's in the Philadelphia Museum of Art. And so we not only have copies of that artwork, but when Gabriel was baptized, that was part of the invitation announcement to our family. So again, he's been a great gift and moved us to places and spaces that we may never have gone to without him.
Yeah. Katie, I'm sure you've been asked this before. There are those people who will say, I'm not sure that white parents need to adopt Black children. You know, do they have the cultural chops, if you will? And that was the subject that social workers debated about decades ago. How do you respond to that when people say, I'm not sure that that's the right thing to do?
Sure. And if you've read the book, you know that my capacity to respond to this question has been very important to Dr. Harrison. So that's a little teaser. So run out and buy the book if you haven't already. But, you know, as you said, as we dove into the research, and as part of the process to this book, you know, it was really important for us to make the research that Val and I have access to. You know, we work in higher education, we work at Temple. We share those Temple roots with you, Tracey, proud alums.
Little owls here.
Yes, exactly. And, you know, we know that that's a privilege to have access to these brilliant scholars and current research. And so we really made it a point to make research accessible to a larger audience, and our audience in particular. So as we dove into the research, I really began to understand the National Association of Black Social Workers position in 1972, you know, advocating for Black children remaining in Black families. And their chief concern was that white families might lack the resources and the knowledge to equip a Black child to develop positive racial identity and navigate life in a racist society. And so as the white mother to my Black son, it is clear to me, you know, white parents must get this simple principle. It is absolutely critical to teach and model positive racial identity in children and develop the tools to effectively cope with issues of race and racism. And what we know is that Black children thrive when their parents, whether the parents are white or Black, right? We know that Black children thrive when we do this. So, you know, where we started, you know, however, for over 400 years in this country, white people have not been expected to acknowledge racism, let alone consider that it might have an effect on the life of a Black child. So I get the pushback. I get the question. And, you know, and with that comes, you know, this ongoing and sort of pressing thing that we face, that Mike and I face on a daily basis. Are we making the priority what is best for Gabriel? And what does that look like and how do we do it? And yes, you know, the desire is there for us, and it has to be there for parents who are committed to this.
Yeah. And Tracey, you know from the beginning of the book, you know, Katie added over this. I'm like, you have to answer this question, you know, because as the research emerged, the association actually softened its stance in the mid-90s. And over the years, we have learned that transracial adoption in and of itself is not harmful. However, Black children do best when they have positive racial identity, or when they feel good about being a part of their racial or ethnic group, and their achievement and their well-being actually depend on it. And so you know, the key takeaway for us was equipping parents to do that. So agree or disagree, and I've had debates with interviewers about transracial adoption, but this is our reality. The proportion of children being raised by a mother of a different race or ethnic group actually rose by 50%, Tracey, between 1999 and 2011. And a large majority of adoptive parents are white, older, well-educated, relatively affluent. And, you know, Katie and I believe that those who have adopted Black children will benefit from the information.
Yeah. Well, and Katie has also talked about the benefit of having you in her life and her family's life. And I enjoyed reading in the book about some of the conversations that you've had around, you know, Gabe's haircuts and taking him to Black churches and that sort of thing. So talk a little bit about that, Val, and just about how you have been able to advise and to kind of pour into Katie and her family.
You know, again, for 20 years, Katie and I hung out and were friends for 20 years. And again, many of our conversations were very theoretical and philosophical and academic. But over the years, we had learned to disagree in a way that was not fatal to the relationship, right? Because we were committed to the friendship, like most friends. And when Gabe came along, again, our disagreements were not fatal because we learned to keep the priority, which was his health and his welfare as well as our friendship. But then we started to learn that friendships, again, back to the point, Tracey, that you helped us to really focus in on, requires humility. And we give some examples in the book. You know, while Katie and I agree on many things, we disagreed on Gabe's hair. You know, I grew up in a tradition that little boys get a haircut at a barbershop by a professional barber shortly after like their first birthday, right? It's like a ritual, a rite of passage. And the barbershop seemed like a place, more than a place where hair was groomed. When I would go with my brother and father, it was a place where stories were shared across generations and dreams were developed and encouraged. Katie's position was that Gabe should have more freedom in terms of his hair. And so we learned about humility. We learned about, from the parenting perspective, Katie asking for support and recognizing another way of being, that for African Americans, we're much more communal. You know, the African proverb says it takes a village to raise a child. And so you seek the assistance of other people. But even from the support side, it requires humility. So while I can give my best advice to Katie, she is his parent and I am not. And so decisions regarding his well-being and even his hair are her decision and her husband's decisions. And so I tried to balance the guidance with being her biggest cheerleader. So I say all of that, but at the end of the day, she did cut his hair. So we won the battle, but with humility, right? Right.
That's
very humble, very humble victory.
Right. It was a humble victory. You're right.
And Katie, you've also visited Black churches, which I'm sure was an interesting experience.
And actually, you know what? I am going to punt to the Val on this. And the other reason why is because I do believe Father Steve Thorne
is on the line.
Is joining tonight. So we definitely need to give a nod to St. Martin de Porres, proudly in the Kingdom of North Philadelphia.
Absolutely. Tracey, you know, the other thing that we knew in terms of exposure and building cultural esteem were concepts of God, right? And worship styles, understanding worship styles. There is nothing that I think demonstrates sort of African and African-American culture like a Black church. In terms of call and response, in terms of music, in terms of the drums. Yeah. And so, Katie, it's important that he sees images of Black people and understands that. So Katie was comfortable doing it because she grew up Catholic, and we have a friend, Father Steve Thorne, who is probably on the line today. And she said, okay, well, let's do it. We'll go to St. Martin de Porres. What she doesn't know is that even a Black Catholic church is like a Black Baptist church, right? And so she didn't realize that. So she confidently went. But in terms of the length of the service, in terms of the volume in terms
we did not pack a lunch for the service, so go on.
Right. And one thing that always bothered Katie about me when we were in workspaces, if there was a presenter who said good morning and I responded good morning, it would annoy her. So she would roll her eyes at me and say, Valerie, everything's not a Black Baptist church. You don't have to respond to everyone. And so we had gone back and forth like this for years. An affirmation, you know, when someone says something that resonates with you, affirming that person verbally annoyed her for years. So we get into the Black Catholic Church, which is like a Black Baptist church, and it is loud, and the woman gets up to the podium and says good morning, and everyone in unison says good morning. So she rolls her eyes at me again. And then the music starts to play. And she's fighting being engaged, but I look over at one point and she's sort of patting her leg.
That's a losing battle.
It is a losing battle. It is, and Father Thorne is as dynamic and engaging as any Baptist preacher, and so she submitted herself though to the discomfort of that, the length of the service and all of that. For the greater good of Gabe being able to be exposed to that cultural experience.
Yeah, which is exactly the kind of advice that you're talking about here. Let me take a moment and just remind our audience that if you've got questions for Val or for Katie, that there is a Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. You can just click on that and enter your questions in there. We've budgeted some time for that toward the end of our conversation. Katie, this really, the things that you're talking about in the book sort of hit us all full force this summer. Mm-hmm. We saw, the death of George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor. And I mean, it was in our face. And then we saw all the racial unrest and the protests. And I'm wondering, and I know that Gabe is only 9, but I'm wondering how you and Mike addressed that with him as all of that was playing out over the summer.
Sure. And it's an important question for a lot of different reasons, but that not the least of which is someone recently asked me, have you been having conversations or did you have conversations with Gabriel about what happened at the Capitol on January 6th? Mm-hmm. And you're right. I mean, there's the part of you that says he's 9, what really do we need to be saying or explaining to a 9-year-old? The problem with that is in today's world, kids have access to information. It's not always accurate information, but they also have access to one another and how one family may be interpreting and how that might be coming into the classroom and into their conversations. And so, one of the places that we found ourselves is that, thank goodness, we have been having these conversations for a long time. And by that, I mean, and it's why the race history of the United States is chapter 2 of this book, right? Is that we need to be presenting accurate, truthful information. That starts with accurate, true history, right? And that carries into what are the values in our home? Kindness is the golden rule in our home, right? And so what my son knows is that there's no penalty for being racist in this country. It has the same results and outcomes as being declared not nice, right? I mean, it's treated the same way. And so, so there are really fundamental conversations that we've been having daily. When kindness is your golden rule, it leaves lots of room for daily conversations, right? And so, so as things were happening and the murder of George Floyd, my son knows 8 minutes, 46 seconds at 9. And so, what we need to do is not keep him from those conversations, but we have to be in the conversations with him, so that we are unpacking it always and asking all the time, tell me more. You know, I love, I was recently listening to a podcast that's going to escape me, so I can't give them proper credit. But just, you know, being persistent with tell me more, and allowing the child to unravel their experience with you, and in a trusting space has really been the key for us.
Val, I'd like to hear your thoughts about that as well. I mean, all parents have, you know, had to grapple with this, and how do we address this with our children, and of course, you know, in an age-appropriate way. But I'd love to hear your thoughts about that as well, especially since this has come to the forefront again.
Right, and one thing that Katie was very intentional about, even in conversations, is keeping at the forefront of the conversation that what happened in 2020 and the first few weeks of 2021 sort of shined a light on what we already knew. None of this is new. In the book, there's a chapter on health disparities, for example. And so COVID-19 is another example of Black people disproportionately impacted by disease. You know, African Americans even now are getting sicker and dying at disproportionately higher rates from COVID-19 for a number of multifaceted reasons, including racism. You know, the book traces the violence of racism, and so that is not something that is new. And so Katie and I talk about it all the time. We just believe that it's critical that Black children understand that when they are treated badly, when they see or witness gatherings that are and messaging that is cloaked in racism, it's not because something is wrong with them, right? I mean, and so that they have to understand that. They have to understand that despite the fact that humans are virtually 100% the same, that a false story was devised by ruling class interests that paleness equals superiority. And they then attach to that value and opportunities in a way that unfairly disadvantaged Black people and Black communities and unfairly advantaged white individuals and white communities. And so they have to understand sort of the systems that came out of it. And most importantly, they have to understand that this false story still operates in the lives of Black people. And so that is what we try to do. And that's the information that we try to equip parents with so that they can have these difficult conversations with their children.
Yeah. Speaking of difficult conversations, Katie, you share a story in the book about a road rage incident involving your husband and what you describe as an old white guy in a minivan.
Yeah.
You and Gabriel were in the car at the time. Tell us what happened there and what the takeaway was for you from that experience.
Yeah. So I definitely don't want to give away too much of the book, but and there may be people listening tonight who can identify with this. You know, another driver just intentionally cutting in, swerving. And my husband was driving, I was in the passenger seat, and our son, who was, I guess, about 7 at the time, was in the back seat, in his booster seat. And, you know, that very visceral moment of when another driver is in your space and compromising your space and what you instinctively or naturally want to do in response. You know, my husband was having a really difficult time restraining what his pure, raw response wanted to be. And, you know, the major takeaway for me, but also for my husband, was that moment revealed the various spaces that Mike and I have both taken for granted, the various spaces in the classroom, you know, riding in cars, you know, having a disagreement with an authority figure. You know, as white parents, I can assure you that Mike and I have nearly never had to consider how someone else felt about us. And if you know me, you know that I challenge authority for sport. You know, and so it has never ever needed to occur to me, you know, that I had to be mindful about how someone else viewed me, or you know, made their assumptions about me simply based on the color of my skin. And so, you know, one of the major lessons in that moment was sort of like this behavior that Mike or I could be modeling to Gabriel, that if he did it at our age, could get him killed. And so, you know, as Gabe, who is probably always going to be shellacked as a sweet, perfect, cute child, but as he approaches double digits and edges further from cute in a white person's eyes, you know, I grow increasingly anxious about preparing him and knowing that my desire to insulate him in my privilege would misguide him, you know, as he faces challenges ahead. And so, you know, for Mike and I both, we want to protect Gabriel from every discomfort. Every parent wants to do that. You know, however, Gabriel will have to regularly endure a range of situations because of the color of his skin. You know, the often daily indignities will come from an encounter with a white woman who will grasp her purse, you know, or lock her doors. And invariably, with two white parents, I'm sure he's going to get the question, why do you talk white? You know, and in each case, he, as the child, will be responsible for making the adult feel comfortable and for getting out of the situation safely. And so again, you know, back to your earlier question, in terms of the challenge, I mean, that's it in a very raw space. You know, how do you ever imagine preparing your child for that level of vulnerability?
Yeah. And I think, Val, there's so much that Katie talked about there. I mean, first of all, the responsibility and the concern of every parent of a Black child as they get older. There's the whole idea of, you know, white people, for what is normal behavior or acceptable for behavior for white people is not always acceptable behavior for Black people, and can get Black folks in trouble sometimes. And there's a lack of awareness around that. I mean, there's so much in what Katie just talked about there for us to think about and kind of unpack a little bit.
And you know, we talk about the importance also of white parents, of white children, to educate their children, because Gabe's friends, he may have white friends. They have to understand that he can't necessarily engage in the same behavior because he is perceived differently. We want them to understand why, how images and negative images have been used throughout time to sort of undermine positive racial identity. You know, slavery and Jim Crow and oppression, it was and it continues to be justified by portraying Black people as inferior, as dangerous even, you know, and then to convey those images in as many outlets as possible. So if you portray a group's members as savage or dangerous, it's easier to justify savagery and violence against them, and it's more difficult to connect with him. And for parents to understand, you know, some in the contemporary media still play a significant role in perpetuating negative images of Black people, overrepresenting them in stories about poverty and crime, and underrepresenting them in positive stories about leadership and parenting and community. And so we try to help them to understand that this is damaging in a number of ways. One is the negative, distorted, and imbalanced images of Black people create perceptions of Blackness that other people respond to. Experiments tell us that white people are more likely to shoot an unarmed Black man than an unarmed white man. And in addition to that, there's a danger that Black young people internalize the negative images. You know, we know that the more that Black people ingest negative media images of themselves, the lower their self-esteem. And so there's also a risk that you'll copy the behavior. So we really come against, in a major way, sort of the images and guarding, and the importance of guarding our children from the negative images while saturating them with positive counter images that actually build their self-esteem and their cultural esteem.
Yeah. I have lots of additional questions for you, but I don't want to cheat our audience out of time. Before we get to our audience Q&A, though, I want to ask each of you very briefly, if there were one takeaway that you would want your readers to take from this book, what would that be? I'll start with you, Katie, and then Val. What would be the most important takeaway for a reader in your view?
Wow, that's a great question. I think at the center of all of this is developing positive racial identity is everything, and it informs everything. As Val said, we try every day to make sure that Gabriel knows he comes from a long line of kings and queens from Africa, right? And his story and his history did not begin in 1619 on the shores of Virginia. Just all of the values and goodness that comes from the beloved community and celebrating the Blackness of our son, and how we can, there's the family you're born into, and then there's the family that you grow and wrap around, which is very much Aunt Vaval. She has been everything, sowing her wisdom into us and into our family as a result. So I think that's the major takeaway. It certainly has been the major takeaway for Mike and I. And I believe it's made us better parents as a result.
Aunt Vaval, what do you say?
So, Trace, well, the context of the book certainly is a transracial adoption, and Gabe is at the center of it. The book is really also about understanding racism. If people could come away and reject this notion that one group of people is better than or superior to another, this notion that has been used for centuries to justify unequal treatment, that is major. And then to embrace a notion that a European or white people's worldview, their culture, their history, their hair, their skin color, their value system, it's just one among many. It's not the standard, it's not universal, and it's not better. It's just different, and it's not entitled to supersede other perspectives. We don't want Black children to walk away believing that they are a smeared carbon copy or a failed effort at being white. And so that is our goal. And if we can reach parents and equip them with some of the tools to help do that, I think that we feel that we have done what our assignment was to do.
Well, on that note, let's go to our questions from our audience, and there are quite a few here. I'll start with this one from Dana, who says, Katie, how did you prepare Gabriel on how to respond to questions from other children regarding his race compared to his parents' race?
Oh, so I will have to say, the education component for adoptive parents, what they try to do to prepare you. I really believe that they did this part well with us. And that was, and I think it's really the nature of why open adoption is so much more common today. And that is, start telling your child their story, even when they're an infant, before you even think that they're making sense of it, because that's more for you than for the baby, right? Because you need all the practice so that his story flows out of you as it was intended. And so get the practice in before they start speaking and learning words and really understanding. And so we've been telling him his story, since I could still hold him. All right, now I'm going to cry. Since I could hold him in my arms. And so part of that story, is his birth father is Black. His birth mother was white. He was born in South Carolina. And you'll see, there's a lot of Clemson paraphernalia in our house because he was born close by to Clemson University. And so there's Clemson paw prints all over the place. It was on his first pacifier. And so, but why I say all of that is because we have been telling him his story, and we've all gotten comfortable with it together, so that, you know, by the time he was in school, and he started at his school when he was 2, he started nursery school there, because he's an only child and we don't have children his age in the neighborhood. So that socialization was really important. And this probably leads into another chapter and another conversation, but it's also why we were really selective about where we started him in school, because we wanted the families and the other students to look just like him. And so, you know, we are really fortunate that he has been at a school since he was 2. He's 9 now. And he has been in a space where the other students and the other families are just this beautiful, you know, array of skin tones. And so, you know, that question has never been scary, and it's never been difficult, because it's been a part of our story, and, you know, and a rich part of our story at that.
Yeah. This one, I think, is a good one for Val. Frederick asks, if you were to give a white educator advice about teaching Black children, what would it be?
To read the book first, right?
Start there.
I think I know a white educator named Frederick, so he'll understand this. But the other issue is there is a chapter on education that talks about the fact that white teachers generally have lower expectations for Black children. This gets back to what we just talked about, Trace, about images, right? And so to the extent that your view of Blackness has been informed by negative and distorted media images, you got to confront that, right? You have to confront your biases, and you have to sort of do some reflection around that, and then make wiser decisions around it. So we devote a chapter to the educational system. We present research that says that Black girls are disciplined more often than girls of any other race or ethnicity, and most boys. They're often viewed as older than their age, right? And it starts early, but it continues. Research tells us that Black women are given less pain medication than white women, because they're perceived as not needing it, right? And so those are the things. And so what our goal is, particularly for educators and healthcare providers, is to do some reflection. We give some tools for that, but then to identify your biases, if you have them, and then to make some wiser decisions around those.
Yeah, tons of questions from our audience. Here's one from Alicia. Alicia's a friend of ours, and I'll ask each of you to answer this. Katie, we'll start with you. Alicia says, what surprised you, or what did you learn about yourself and your own sense of identity in writing the book?
Yeah, well, I welcome that question. I love the opportunity to talk about that, because, and this, I think it goes really well with what we were talking about earlier, and that is so much of this book is a result of self-discovery and heart and soul work. And, you know, it's why, Val, I think it's exactly the right answer for any teacher, any healthcare worker, any coach, anybody who wants to do better. You have to do your own work first. And you know, for those, so my husband is a licensed professional counselor. And so I get a lot of advice and support that way too. But, you know, one of the things that he will always say is, you know, you can't help anybody else until you do your own work and look inward first. And so, you know, for me, all of the insights that have been revealed to us through the research and then the writing, but then also how we sort of checked, how Val and I checked one another, was really critical. And having these difficult and sometimes uncomfortable conversations, you know, not only doing your own work, but then finding those relationships with people who will test you and push you.
Yeah. Val, what do you say about that? What did you learn about yourself, about your identity? What did you discover in the process of this book?
You know, I have to go back to the issue of humility, right? The issue of boundaries and understanding our own biases. I was an employment lawyer for many, many years, and so we looked at discrimination cases. People tend to select people who are just like them, right? People tend to surround themselves with people who are just like them. And so much of the challenge around sort of hiring and diversity and that kind of thing results from our own internal biases. And so I had to confront those as well. There are many Black people who are still challenged by the notion of a Black boy being raised in a white family. And so we have to challenge those assumptions that we make and really come out on the other end of this thing, understanding what's really important and how we can be community to each other. And so this has been a wonderful experience for me as well in that way. And that's why I sort of pushed Katie a little bit around being able to defend, the critics who talk about that. We've done a lot of work, the two of us, around that issue. We have confronted it. We have wrestled with that. And I think we've come out on the other side very, very clear about it, but also clear about the need to do everything that we can as a community to help Gabe to feel good about being a Black man. And we know that will allow him to thrive. That in addition, again, Katie talked about it earlier, a big house and a good school and summers at the shore. None of that will replace positive racial identity. And that's the stuff that he'll need to really thrive.
Yeah. Val, I'm going to direct this next question to you from Michael. It says, one of the themes of the book is the importance of educating Americans about the history of racism in this country and its connection to contemporary racism. There's so much pushback in segments of the white community to focusing on those issues. Just look at all the criticism of the 1619 Project. How do you get people to listen?
We've tried to confront it head on, Tracey. The false story of racial superiority is so baked into the fabric of American culture that it's hard for many segments of the community to see that anything is even wrong. Even the concept of a meritocracy, Tracey. I have white colleagues and friends who have worked very, very hard to get where they are. However, many of them don't acknowledge that everybody wasn't permitted to play. So you weren't competing against everyone, you were competing against a smaller group. And so we actually confront head on issues of a meritocracy. We confront issues of philanthropy being different from racial equity. It is different to give children backpacks to go into a dilapidated, rundown school. That's different from fighting for racial equity so that schools provide the same educational opportunities. And so what we've tried to do, to Michael's question, we actually say it, we get it. It's hard for segments of the community to understand it. The other thing is, the reality is people won't work to change a system that works for them.
Right.
And so we challenge people by saying, even if your excess, came from racist policies that disadvantaged other groups, people aren't willing to part with excess resources. And so we present a challenge in the book with the hope that people will be more introspective and move closer to racial equity, in their own individual lives.
Katie, this question is for you from Ida. Does Gabe embrace his racial identity, and do his friends reflect his identity?
He does. And we are really fortunate that in addition to Aunt Vival and Uncle Steve Thorne, and, he is surrounded in many ways by just these magnificent examples. And so in doing that, and we've also fostered those relationships with friends at school, and then the parents. And so having that relationship, it really is celebrated. And he's actually really quite good at it.
Well, I have a follow-up here for you, Katie, and this one is from Sharonda, who asks, do you believe that it's important to demonstrate your values to him being Gabe, by taking action against racism?
Constantly. And, you know, so Gabe, one of Gabe's first peaceful protests was the first Women's March in January 2017. We went to Washington, D.C. And I mean, you couldn't have imagined the power of a moment like that with millions of people all in unison. And again, you know, he understands the significance of taking a knee. You know, and so we talk a lot about Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. You know, he knows what peaceful protest means, and he knows models and examples of it. And so, you know, he is coming up constantly sort of surrounded by this information. But I also want to pick up on what Val was talking about. And I'm kind of channeling Dr. Eddie Glaude, another Proud Temple alum, here, you know, because until we confront, and these are his words, until we confront these demons and choose to act differently, we will keep finding ourselves in this same place, right? Destined to repeat the same behavior. And I think, Tracey, you interviewed Ijeoma Oluo.
Oh, yes, last week.
It was the night before the inauguration of Vice President Kamala Harris.
2 weeks ago, right.
Yeah, and she speaks to this too. You know, if we don't pay attention to these patterns, right, of violence, of brutality, you know, of these policies and practices that enable and sustain racism, and point them out, show them, then we will continue to repeat this over and over again until we choose to do something different and tear these systems down. And so, you know, there is a special spark of activism in Gabriel because, you know, and that's been the blessing of these years that he's been coming up, you know, but without knowing our history and without knowing the accurate one, you know, and it's on us, you know, Mike and I are having to learn the history that we were never properly taught, right? But until we understand the accurate one and see these patterns that continue to repeat themselves, then moments like the Capitol, you know, the insurrection at the Capitol and the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, the 2016 election, you know, that will all appear uniquely alarming when in fact it's just, we're just in repeat, we're just in a cycle that we can't break until we break the systems that have created them and sustain them.
So as we're in our last few minutes here, I just want to read a couple of notes from our audience. Dottie says, thank you so much for your compassion. Sharonda says, I'd like to recommend a curriculum called Raising a Black Scholar to assist in a complete lesson on Black history. That is Raising a Black Scholar. So that might be of interest to folks in our audience as well. Yeah. And this one I think would be a good one for us to end on, and it's a bit of a recap, but one of our audience members says, thank you so much. I haven't read the book yet, but I am the white adoptive mother of an incredible young Black son. You mentioned giving your son exposure to the Black church. What are your top recommendations to help give our young Black sons positive racial identity? So I'll say, Katie, you take that, and then Val, you chime in as well.
I think Val is like glowing so much. She's just going to explode through the scene. Oh, so, I mean, it is everything. And the gift of where we are, I mean, I don't know, you know, Tracey, you, me, Val, I mean, we not only have deep Temple roots, we have deep Philadelphia roots. And so we have access to art and music and history and church, I mean, in every possible form. And so, you know, we really, Val has said this before too, you know, we really take seriously the question that genuinely comes from people, You know, it's everything from how do I make a Black friend to how do I get myself invited into these spaces? You know, and so I think we really just have to look out for one another and be as inclusive, you know, of inviting. It's made all the difference to Mike and I. You know, we have just been embraced fully by Aunt Val, you know, Uncle Steve, and so many others that just, they see me and Mike and they see Gabriel and they say, we've got you, you know? And so however you can get those invitations, right? Or seek them out. But it's everything. It's everything. Go ahead, Val. I know you're trying to.
I'm so excited. I was so excited about that question. That was great. But the book does. We identify the things that have been found to be effective in building positive racial identity while reducing the negative impact of racism. And we give a laundry list of things. We've talked about some of them: limiting negative and distorted images of Black people, saturating, and not just children. I keep saying children, but you know, you don't age out of low self-esteem and low cultural esteem and psychological distress and physical pain from being marginalized. You don't age out of it. And so even for adults, I think the process of identity development can continue. But again, saturating ourselves with positive images.
All right, I think we have a. There we go. There we go.
The best
Val,
of African and African American
we lost
culture.
you for a second there. Okay.
Okay. And so, well, we made it all the way through. I mean, that's it. Okay. Well, that's great. Just saturating yourself with positive images. And again, the best of African and African American culture, and building a community that reflects your son's identity, I think is wonderful. And again, the book has a range of options and recommendations for parents.
Yeah. Well, on that note, I want to thank the two of you. The book is Do Right by Me, Learning to Raise Black Children in White Spaces. Katie, thank you for raising Gabe in such a way that he will have an incredible sense of cultural and racial pride, and for all the work that you and your family are doing with him. Val, for giving us the historical perspective around all of this and why we need to understand the history so that we can, in fact, do right by our Black children in white spaces or any spaces for that matter. Thank you so much for writing this wonderful book and putting it out into the world. I think a lot of people will benefit from it, and a lot of us wish you had written it decades ago. So thank you so much for the book.
Thank you, Tracey.
Thank you, Tracey, so much for all of this.
And I want to say a special thank you to all the folks here at the Free Library, to Andrew, to Irma, to also to Gary Kramer at Temple, who has been working with Val and Katie, but to everyone at the Free Library Author Event Series. Thank you all so much. And thanks to our audience for spending your time with us and taking time to understand this very, very important issue. Thanks to all of you. Be safe. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time. Good night, everybody.